What about Europe, Ajit? Do Europe need this kind of, is it needed to have some sort of player that corresponds to NIST in the US context?
Yes, I think what we must first realize, I said that yesterday as well, we can't build 21st century systems on 20th century technology. So essentially, this is an unprecedented challenge in many ways, of and especially when we have different domains who are traditionally not used to talking to each other. That's the time you need somebody to coordinate all this work. I mean, if you give telecoms examples, you have NFC, nuclear communication, driven by in London, the transportation, the London Oyster card. But putting that on a phone is a different set of standardization bodies which need to talk to each other. You have the same problem with RFID as well, because RFID is driven by supply chain people. And putting that into other stuff has the same issue. Now, my question really is, to what extent should the standardization go driven by this coordinating body? And the secondary question after that is, do we need something simpler after that? For example, like the Wi-Fi Alliance. The Wi-Fi Alliance is a body. It's a simple body of people in the companies, and they all work together. And it's actually a subset. It actually is designed to make it work on a smaller scale. So there is a standardization, and there is also a more kind of light LITE version of that, which makes practical implementation. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that we need both, and we need that flexibility.
In terms of other obstacles, Kevin, the role given to NIST, and NIST has been working on this, is clearly to identify standards that can facilitate interoperability and make the different components of the smart grid work. But in terms of other obstacles, legally and technically and politically, what kind of obstacles do you see in the rather fragmented U.S. market in terms of both the number of utilities that we heard about, but also the state regulation in this area?
I think the way that you put the question is telling, right? So some of the answer is already in the phrasing of the question. So NIST, as we've heard, is really the bridge builder when it comes to the technical components, to making sure that there's interoperability there, that components are speaking to each other, that there's an efficient technical architecture for the smart grid deployment. That said, as your question indicates, we have a highly fragmented regulatory system in the U.S. for governing electricity. The locus of power when it comes to regulating large utilities in the United States is in state public utilities commissions. And these commissions are not uniform in the way they operate, and to the extent they allow cost recovery for different kinds of things. So we have a situation where you have many state public utilities commissions that are doing things differently. And to the extent that they're even able to cooperate with other jurisdictions and consider extraterritorial interest in making their decisions for their state, this is a gray legal area. And it's a great concern for regulators to figure out the extent to which they can cooperate within their various regions so that they can optimize for the greater good, if you will, rather than just having state-specific interests. That said, then we come to the federal level, and we can't do this without the extraordinary assistance and coordination of the federal government, which is to say, again, we have states with many different kinds of resources. Some have very strong renewable resources. States in the Southwest, some would argue, have much less in terms of renewable resources. But the federal government here can step in and play a critical organizing role in bringing these entities together. So, to answer the question, it is the fact that we have this, in some respects, cumbersome, fragmented system that makes it difficult. But it's also important to understand that this fragmented system is there because we have very heterogeneous policies and resources throughout the United States.
Some would argue that some of the state regulations are actually an obstacle to the development of the smart grid in terms of the incentive it gives to the utility to invest and innovate and deploy the smart grid, and possibly also to let others in. Do you see a trend where the states are responding in a similar fashion to the task given by the administration and playing sort of in a coordinated way with the efforts made by NIST?
I think it's a mixed bag. You can see states like Colorado that seem to be willing to, at the utility commission level, allow cost recovery for smart grid deployment. But the truth is that in the United States we have a least cost mandate for capital expenditures when it comes to utilities. This is largely true. And smart grid as a technological deployment doesn't fit in with the notion of least cost. That is, unless you start internalizing the costs of doing other kinds of status quo behavior, which is not something that utility commissions typically do. So you're seeing some utility commissions reject smart grid deployment efforts. This happened in Maryland and other places. And I think this is because we are still, as a regulatory community, figuring out how to wrap our minds around the concept of internalizing things that we've never internalized before, and understanding that the least cost alternative over the long run is perhaps not the optimal or most strategic choice. And this is something we're wrestling with.
Just moving to the question of interoperability and the role of interoperability, George, in terms of interoperability for the smart grid, why do we need interoperability for the smart grid?
Well, I'd say where we are today with the existing grid is very much like where the computer industry was 30 years ago, where you had different suppliers like IBM or DEC with proprietary architectures. And so if the business had in one part of their operation a system that used IBM's SNA architecture, and let's say in another part of their operation a mini computer-based DECnet system, and you need to integrate them into an overall business process, this became very, very expensive and sometimes infeasible. With the smart grid, we really need the ability to move information end to end so that you can have a wide area of visibility of distributed resources and be able to balance that effectively. The ability to support, let's say, charging for electric vehicles as they go around from state to state. And so you can't do this without having interoperability and standards.
The thing is that this seems to be something that has been going on for quite some time, both in the telecom and also the software industry, while utilities haven't been working all that much with interoperability issues. So is this something where the telecoms and the software companies are in the lead for the smart grid?
Yeah, this is a huge change for the electric utility industry, and I would say 2 years ago, the participation by the IT industry and the communications providers in the smart grid efforts was very low. That's now been reversed, and they are really very strong participants. So what we really need to do, and we are doing, is getting the collaboration of these different perspectives to basically design a system, an end-to-end system that is based on open standards, layered architectures, all of the principles that have allowed the IT industry to really have transformative change.
Is this accepted by the utilities? I mean, these other industries could potentially be their competitors in some of this smart grid space. Right?
Well, with 3,200 utilities, it's hard to, I haven't polled each one, but I would say the utilities that have most resources and are doing R&D are very much behind this, because they see this as increasing competition, innovation, lowering their costs, and that results in lower costs to consumers. So this is a no-brainer for them. The smaller utilities that really are kind of followers, I think will just come along. The utility industry as a whole has bought into this concept.
And what about you, Ajit? Do you see the parallel to the traditional walled garden in the telecom industry?
Yes, I mean, I come from the telecoms industry, and I've talked about open gardens, which is really the name of our blog as well. And the play on the word walled gardens really is opening up of telecom networks. Absolutely, there are similarities, and I think George pointed them out with the SNA. I mean, that's not telecoms, but the same concept, that you really had to have the SNA technets to get to IP before we actually started to see innovation at higher levels of the stack. In other words, services. So my vision of this is that in many ways, what we are seeing, what NIST is doing is kind of interoperability at different levels: device levels, network levels, and services levels. The device and network level, this is perfect, because really what is happening is we need the equivalent of IP and HTTP, because those protocols actually get people to talk to each other at network and device level. At a services level, that's more complex. I think that's where you perhaps need a more innovation from the industry and vendors and third parties and so on and so forth. This is where I see this value that by bringing the device and network players together, we start to create what is conceptually what we see in the IT industry as protocols and device layer. And then, of course, then innovation comes in by